We're live.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Speaking Up series of the ICHRRF. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I'm the president of ICHRRF. Let's move to the next slide, please. This is the logo of the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the ICHRRF, I invite all the audience members to this monthly Speaking Up series oration. Next slide, please. A little bit about ICHRRF mission. ICHRRF is a US-based non-profit organization that is focused on upholding human rights and religious freedom all over the world through continuous monitoring, policy interventions, and collaboration. We are focused on educational, research, legal, and human rights advocacy and charitable purposes, and we strive to be an advocate for the human rights and religious freedom of underrepresented communities across the world, including the United States. We do believe that humankind can no longer afford to be selectively vocal about rights of only a specific set of people, which generally happens. A humane and just world requires fair treatment for all living beings. Our focus is on indigenous rights and freedom, free speech, and their cultural preservation. Therefore, at the ICHRRF, we strive to be the voice of the voiceless. Next slide, please. Some of our initiatives include monitoring violations of the freedom and sanctity of religious and philosophical minorities across the world, research into documentation of culture, history, and challenges faced by such communities, policy recommendations on human rights, religious diversity, and pluralism to international organizations, agencies, national and local governments, collaboration to support the cultural and philosophical diversity across the world. We do have Professor Ved P. Nanda Memorial Fellowship Training Program, and we hope that some of the young folks will apply for that. We do once a year an annual meeting that was held in October of 2025. Next slide, please. So today's oration, the title is Islamic Colonization and Jihad in Africa, Castration of Slaves. And our distinguished speaker today is Professor Rinita Mazumdar. Next slide, please. That's her picture, and you also see her on the video. A little bit about Professor Mazumdar. She received her PhD in psychology from University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and she has the unique distinction of having 3 master's degrees from 3 different countries. She has Master of Science in Psychology from University of Phoenix in Arizona, a Master of Philosophy from Brock University in Ontario, Canada, and Master of Philosophy from Calcutta University in India. Currently, she is Professor of Philosophy at the Central New Mexico Community College. She is an affiliated professor of women's study at University of New Mexico. She is director of Sovaka Harshita Foundation. She has been a visiting professor at several universities internationally, and she is author of 10 books so far, covering feminism, post-colonial history, and Islam's historical record in the interfaith space, with particular focus on Africa and India. Next slide, please. And of course, that gives you the picture of the slaves from Africa. Next slide, please. So the focus of today's lecture is on Africa. Islam actually began in Africa immediately after its outset in 7th century Common Era. Islamic kingdoms have been at forefront of slave trading across Africa and Asia, and that's a fact that is not usually acknowledged. When we talk about slave trade, we talk about mainly about the white European colonialists, but we forget about the role of Islamic kingdoms in what is called Middle East or West Asia and North Africa. This continues, unfortunately, in the current times. If somebody thinks that was a practice 200, 300 years ago, that is not true. There are still some countries in Africa where actually slavery goes on, specifically Chad and Mauritania, where they practice slavery. And we all know in last 2 decades, actually, there was Black African genocide at the hands of Sudanese Arabs that profess the Islamic faith. And this happened in Darfur and South Sudan, leading to creation of South Sudan. These traditions actually, Islam itself did not start the slavery process that was there in the indigenous societies in Africa and West Asia. But after the Islam, it also picked up this tradition. And treatment of African slaves in West Asia was so brutal that they did not even retain the ability to reproduce themselves. So it was, in a way, genocide, because if you were castrating the male slaves, they were not able to procreate. So this webinar will cover these historical aspects and also touch upon some present day aspects of slavery in Africa under some of the Islamic regimes. Her talk would be for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have opportunity for questions and answers. Next slide, please. This is my favorite quote: "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Speak up and judge fairly." That is our message to everyone. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping rules, basically, please mute yourself, keep your cell phone on vibration mode. When our distinguished speaker is speaking, please don't interrupt her. There will be question and answer at the end of the lecture. Send your questions through the chat room, and please ask very precise questions. Don't write lengthy comments in the guise of a question. We will kind of ignore those lengthy comments. Just be specific in asking questions. The session is being recorded. It will be available later on our YouTube channel and on our website. And those of the audience members who want a certificate of attendance, we do provide certificate of attendance. You have to write to christina.kalasunas@ichrrf.org for your certificates of attendance. And lastly, people who are based in US, we request you with folded hands to support, donate, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website. Thank you very much indeed. And without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to invite our distinguished speaker, Professor Rinita Mazumdar. Professor Mazumdar, the platform is yours.
Good morning to everyone, and thanks ICHRRF for inviting me to do this. I am no way an expert. I'm learning. Research is always ongoing, and this is a hugely complex topic. Of course, I'll touch on mainly the historical and the theological background, but I'll also do a little psychoanalysis, because actually I will give two stories, because as a feminist, I think storytelling is the best thing for this kind of historical trauma. Uh, how Freud was wrong in some aspects, because castration was a big thing, which is more psychological, metaphorical in Freud. Now, I have to do a background before I go into the actual what happened, why castration and so forth. But that I'll do. I'll go a little fast. And if I'm going too fast, please slow me down, because I have to maintain time. All right. So shall I start sharing?
Please start. Please start.
Yes. Share. All right. Now, I will start with the little bit of, this is a long PowerPoint. So there's no way I'm going to go through all of this, because this is not a presentation on jihad. It's on castration of a specific kind of slavery. But why am I doing this? Because this is the fundamental thing. Jihad, slavery, the eunuchs, they are integrally connected. So if I just start presenting castration, eunuchs, they won't make sense. We have to contextually understand this. So let's see. There are several versions of jihad, but the original term jihad comes from the word jahada, at the Arabic verbal noun jahada, which means strain, exertion, endeavor. And EP Lane says the using or exerting one utmost power and endeavor with an object of disapprobation. For example, and we'll go through this, I want to attain something which is not good for me, so I'm restraining myself. Now, what is interesting is jihad originally came out of intra-Muslim conflict from the Khwarijis of Persia, and Persians were Shias, so it was originally a Shia thing. And the division between the Shias and the Sunnis happened with the fourth Rashidun Caliph, who's the Ali, cousin of Prophet. So, what is that jihad? That jihad in the Persian sense, Khwariji sense, it was a revolt against an oppressive ruler. And my way of understanding it, because I'm trained in the Western pedagogy, my way of understanding is the French are revolting against Louis the 16th, against the monarch, oppressive monarch. But it didn't stay like that. And for them, somehow it evolved. It went out of that Khwarizmi theology into the mainstream Sunnis. Um, for the Khwarizis, it's a sixth pillar of Islam. Now, this doesn't mean that the Quran doesn't have the word jihad. It's there. But what I'm saying is, in action, this was how it started to be actually put into action. There are the three main senses of the word jihad. Jihad bin al-naf. Like I'm saying, someone has blood sugar and they yearn for sweets. So they're restraining themselves. Restrain. This is very close to Aristotle's virtue also. Jihad bin al-naf. Then jihad bin al-swaf, which is the jihad of the military jihad, and jihad al-qawal, which is the preaching of the tongue. Now, it's very interesting, and I'm again, because this is not on jihad, I'm not going to go through the very important doctrine of nashk or abrogation. Usually, they make a distinction, scholars, from what I learned from Mufti Imran Basir. Um, Usually they make a distinction between the earlier, more peaceful verses, the surah, the sunnah, in the Meccan verses, and then the Median verses, which are more militaristic. And so Allah's word cannot be cut off. So they have a doctrine of nas, that this is overcoming this. So Jihad bin al-Saf is the one that the Sunni, that mainstream one. So fighting, what is this fighting? This is very important, and I've studied this to some extent. The legal interpretation is this: jihad is the moral duty of every believer. I'm using the word believer instead of Muslims, because then we'll set the context. Fighting whom? Fighting what? Fighting the kafirs by striking their property, demolishing their places of worship, of course, killing them. And I will talk a little bit about Lemkin's definition of genocide. Killing doesn't mean like real killing. It's much more complex. So, and smashing the place of idols, etc. Who are these kafirs? Okay, and this I have studied to some extent with Mufti. And kafirs are of two types. They did not have anyone who could be considered Hindus or Buddhist in Mecca at that time. So we have derived the left hand side from what they said about the polytheist of Mecca, which was their the dominant religion, including the religion of the Prophet, was that polytheism. They did not have the philosophy that Hindus and Buddhists, etc., they have, but the polytheism was there. So the unbelievers are of two types: people of the book. Now, with Zoroastrians, there is a controversy. Christians and Jews who are dhimmis, they can live with paying the jizya and The real unbelievers are the Qurayshi tribes, the actual tribe of the Prophet. For them, they have exactly two options. And I'll give some quotations from the Holy Quran. Their options are either you convert, which means you are dead, your identity is dead, you have a new identity. So that's also is genocide, or you are killed. Now, so Surah 9 verse 5, once the sacred months have passed, killing the polytheists who violated their treaties, whatever means you find, capture them, besiege them, lie in wait for them in every way, for them they repent, perform prayers and pay alms taxes, set them free. Indeed, Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. This is one verse. The other thing is Surah Al-Nisa, ayat 95 in the Arabic text. Why I quoted this, I find this very interesting. Not all believers, not all Muslims are the same. Some will sit at home and they won't do what is their holy duty, most sacred duty, which is fighting the non-believers, kafirs. If they're disabled, then they're forgiven, but they are not as high in the rank as those believers who are fighting the kafirs, because that's the moral duty. It's an essence of being a believer or a Muslim. Who can declare a legitimate jihad? Only an emir can declare. Even of course, when they say even if he's a crop nose Ethiopian, there is racism involved. I'm not going into it, but usually this is the more or less interpretation of the scriptures. This is very important for us. What is this jihad for? This jihad is from the ungoverned land to the land of utopia or peace, called the Darul Islam. Darul Harb is the ungoverned land. Now, that is not all. There in between, there are some in between. Dar al Sulk and Dar al Ard. What are they? They are, first of all, let me mention one thing before I go into these. A Muslim cannot stay under a non-Muslim ruler. That's one thing. But they can stay only if with a covenant, Darul Sulk or Darul Harb, which is temporary. But here is the thing, they have to continuously struggle. So when people are thinking that why are they killing kafirs, Bangladesh, why are they kill kafirs? There's no battle between a believer and a kafir in Bangladesh right now, but there is. It's underground because the struggle is continuous. It's not a one-time thing. Now I'm in battle, Kurukshetra, I fight, otherwise, it's not dharma, it's not like that. It's continuous till you reach Darul Islam. And this is what kafirs have some epistemic violence. They don't understand. They this is the structure. This is the duty. Now, from what I've learned from my study of the scriptures and from Mufti, is that most Muslim majority nations, even with a theocratic state, for example, Turkey is a secular constitution, but it's still a Muslim majority. Saudi Arabia is a theocratic, sorry, Turkey is a secular constitution, but Muslim majority, and Saudi Arabia is a theocratic state itself. It doesn't matter, because the kind of Islam that they're performing is not the correct Islam given in the scriptures. The correct Islam, the closest to it, is Afghanistan and ISIS. So they have to struggle to get there. All right, permanent resident in non-Muslim territory is prohibited. So that's why they have to go on struggling. And when they cannot win, like in Mecca, a hijrah has to be performed. They have to go underground. This is how armed revolutions are. Medina, the hijrah is performed, and then they come back, etc. So Uswa Khaswana, the military jihad, is performed. Now, I'm not going to go to all of this because this is more jihad. So what I'm going to go into now is the second slide, which is how is this connected? That's the philosophy of jihad. How is this connected to slavery? So let me share that. Yes, sorry. Is it visible?
Yes.
All right. So I'll start with Aristotle and how this is very different from Aristotle's theory of slavery. For Aristotle, this is a bit, I mean, that's too much, but this is better. Everything has a purpose, from the tiny micro dot of the dust to the stars, and everything has a purpose. Our eyes have a purpose, and when there's no purpose for the eyes, they will dissolve, etc. So for Aristotle, the polis or the state has a purpose, but that's not the fundamental structural unit of human society. The structural unit is the oikos. It's interesting, we get the word economics from the word oikos in Greek. The household, and then several household, oikos one, oikos. Household is not our nuclear family, and we'll get to who lives there. They form villages, and several villages together form the polis. Each has different purpose. What is the purpose of the household? Economics. And when I say economics, in Aristotle, economics included both production, what our market does, our food, our shelter, our clothing, and reproduction, the rearing of the next generation. They're both incorporated. So, and also financial. In other words, the oikos in Aristotle would be both our banks, our market, and our daycare centers, family, etc., everything. So the purpose, that is the purpose, is economics of the oikos. The purpose of the village is to bring several oikoses together. The purpose of the polis is political happiness. That's Aristotle. But for us, this is more important. Who lives in the oikos? The master, who organizes, then subordinate to the master is the Greek woman and children, and then the slaves. Now, why is this important to us? Is because this hierarchy that Aristotle gives us is very different from the justification of slavery in Islam. This is based on more or less an evolutionary theory. The master is naturally the master because he possesses rationality. Well, he has a gender and a race. He's a Greek male, but that's not the point. He possesses rationality. The Greek woman is subordinate because, being Greek, she has rationality, but it's confused. Meaning what? Meaning she has rationality, but she cannot make decisions. She becomes confused. So she has to be subordinate. And then slaves, they have no rationale. Then why are they there? Well, everyone has a purpose. They have a purpose. They're great in manual labor, so they have to be there. This, you cannot question this. Why? Because it's natural. It's like asking, why does water flow down and not up? Oh, why do, when you throw things, they go towards the surface of the earth? You are questioning the law of gravitation. It's natural for Aristotle. Of course, he made a mistake. He says that well, slaves are either born or obtained through war. Then he was questioned. Well, then it's not natural, because your prisoners of war were previously free men. Now you've converted them into slaves. And he will say, no, they're also slaves because they're defeated by the Greeks, so they're inferior to the Greeks. So it's also natural. So for Aristotle, the whole thing is natural. Now, this is not Islam. Islam is very, very unique in this, and then we'll come to castration and so the eunuchs. See, in Islam, there are many, many interpretations. So when I gave those surah and sunnah, and Mufti and I talked about it, it doesn't mean that there is one interpretation. For example, there is no force in conversion. There's the rector of Cairo University said that. But one basic structure is there, more or less, from what I understand. And my reading is not perfect. It's still ongoing. You know, these research is very complex. A binary. What is the binary? Believer, kafir, non-believer. The Mufti and I, he's my teacher. He's from Bangladesh, but now in hiding in Nepal with a Hindu family. Mufti said that the meaning of kafir is one who hides truth. In pre-Islamic polytheist, or if you want to call it pagan, Mecca, the meaning of kafir was one who, the farmers who hid the seed. And that was taken out. And a kafir is one who knows the truth but hides it. He's a deceiver. So a kafir is the one, see, this is the binary structure which is throughout all the entire holy book. And then you have Surah Al-Baqarah 47:4, when you thoroughly subdue them, had Allah willed himself, he could have inflicted punishment, but he does not, only to test some of you by means of others, and those who are martyred in the cause of Allah. So again, an epistemic violence from the kafir's point of view is what we are seeing as terrorism, murder is actually a holy duty. Now, it is this ideally, within this theological, philosophical framework, every kafir is a slave of a believer. And it's your holy duty to bring them into your fold, which is not going to happen till we reach the utopia. So, uh, positively, okay, now here we go. How do you obtain the slaves? Only a kafir can be your slave. There's a contradiction there. When you meet the unbelievers, smite their necks. Then when you have made wide slaughter among them, tie fast the bonds of slavery, etc. So it's a social institution and it's your moral duty. So every kafir is potentially a slave. It's not that he's not a slave, he's a little better, this, he's the color, race, all this doesn't matter. This is the ideal. But what I'm not going to discuss here, because time, we have time constraint, is it's very interesting. They reinterpreted the story of Noah and Shem and Japheth. What happened is Noah was sleeping once, and this is a taboo. It's incest taboo. You cannot see the king naked. You cannot see your father naked. So Ham, the third son of Noah, this is from the Old Testament. He saw father naked, and he came and told his brother. And so his brothers, what they did is they walked backwards so they don't see the father naked, and they put a cover over him, so they never saw him. They never broke the taboo, which related to Freud. If we have time, I'll talk about it. So what happened is Ham got a curse. All the children lineage of Ham are black, and Ham, Shem and Japheth, they are not black. So even if they're converted, and this is very interesting in the case of the subcontinent, I've done some study on conversion, they they they're still believers. But what this one says, that every believer is your brother, every non-believer, this binary really doesn't, their racism comes in. But that's not part of our thing. So this is what slavery is. Slavery is related to jihad. How are slaves obtained? They're born to slave parents, same as Aristotle. They're captured in jihad, which is ghazwa. You wait, and when the caravan passes, you capture them. When you capture them, the males and the females in Africa also, they became slaves. But usually the female and the children are gonima. They're booties of the slave. Ghazwa, that's the ghazwa. So, who are these slaves? All kafirs, mushrikans. And Abed al-Aziz ibn Ahmed al-Bukhari, 1330, said, servitude is the vestige of obstinity in refusing to believe in one God. All kafirs are slaves, which didn't work. Their racism came in. It shouldn't be. It should be based on this binary, but that's not true. So there's jihad everywhere here. Then these are more, historical things. But these are not very important for us. I'll just go through a scene. Many Zawa refused to support him. There are numerous pillages of the Fulani Almeds. These are all pagan. They mainly took the slaves from the pagan communities. I'll just read one from J. Swan's Fighting the Slave Hunters in Central Africa, just to show how terrible it was. As they filed past, we noticed many chained together by the neck. The women, who were as numerous as the men, carried babies on their backs, in addition to the task of ivory or other burden on their head. It is difficult to adequately describe the filthy state of their bodies, except cut by a chicote, piece of hide, but feet and shoulders were a mass of open sores, half-starved, ill-treated people. That's all. But what's very interesting in this case is the our the main point of our uh, presentation today are the eunuchs. This is very, very special. So now I am ready for the eunuchs. And the way I'm going to present this, I will give some historical background why the eunuchs, how the castration happened, and also some psychoanalytic backgrounds. But what is very fascinating to me, I'm still doing that research, so I can't claim that I've done it all, is actually in the real life, some of the lives of the eunuchs contradicted what Freud said. How so? Let's go through that. All right, most of the eunuchs were from Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, Sudan, a black country. Horns of Africa, Nubia, Sudan were victims of these trades. The transportation and castration of African eunuchs formed part of a much larger trade in African slaves along overland caravan routes and through the Red Sea. A shifting collection of castration centers existed across supra-equatorial Africa. In East Africa, Upper Egypt, there was a key center. In Central and West Africa, Bagirmi became a center in the 18th century. So it's not that far off. Not a good map, but this is what most books will have. No, this is, I don't think this is a very map that explains it, but this is more or less the procreation of the slave trade. All right, so what are the reasons? According to David Allen, slavery and concubinage. Now here I have to make a note. I presented Aristotle's theory of the structure. Slaves, where were they in Aristotle? They were not in the polis. Women, Greek women and slaves were not allowed to go to the polis because polis was a place of free discussion. And the purpose of the polis was eudaimonia or happiness. Because for Aristotle, you cannot have happiness. The word happiness is not a good translation of eudaimonia. It's more harmony, but I'm using it because most books on Aristotle uses that. Slaves and women were not allowed. Why? Because they have no rationality, and polis is a place of free discussion. Now, where is oikos? The bottommost layer. What's the purpose? Economics. Where did slaves inhabit? Mostly in the oikos. Here, most researchers will tell us that the transatlantic slave trade was very much connected to the Industrial Revolution. Slaves would work outside or the public space, plantation, etc. And my research is not that good, so I can't make any more comments on the transatlantic slave trade. But Aristotle, because it was a slave, was used more for domestic labor, like servants and so forth. That was also there in the transatlantic one, but that was less. In this case, it was all mostly domestic labor. That's why the relationship, according to David Allen and others who have done research on it, the relationship between the master and the slave was more intimate. It's a client-patron relationship. There was no such thing as retirement. It was more like your own kinship. That's the word. That's the feminist word. It was a kin. And I've seen in India also in the olden times when they had servants who stayed over generations, they became almost like a family member. So this slavery was like that. Slavery and concubinage plus the seclusion of Muslim women created ideal condition for the introduction of eunuch in every great number in Muslim society, especially in the courts of the rulers' homes of the well-to-do, etc. So this was not a plantation, not a public slavery, because this was not really connected at all to the Industrial Revolution. This was a labor. Of course, slavery is labor and concubinage, and more like Aristotle, although Aristotle's explanation justification is different, but here it's more domestic labor, domesticity, and the relationship was more of a kin. And even I've seen when I was very little, my grandmother used to talk about someone who worked for them, like a maid or something, used to call her aunt. So it's something like that. The major advantage that eunuchs have over emasculated servants and slaves was that the eunuch could move the private and the public space. And this is very interesting for me. Because of time, we won't go there. Is the ambivalent identity was actually an advantage. Gender identity, how it develops when we go to psychoanalysis, will do that. The eunuch compared to non-eunuchs, they could move in both sphere, the public and the private. They're bringing the two together, the public sphere of the court and the royalty and whatever, because these are mostly eunuch. These slaves were mostly for the elite class, and the private sphere of the woman's place. So the oikos and the polis kind of coming together here. That was not true in Aristotle. I'm just giving that as an example. So they had a dual identity. When the number of women increased in the court, the number of eunuchs also increased. Why? Because they were continuously with them. Soon the eunuch become indispensable and most conspicuous element in the palatial court. And this is something very interesting. We'll get to that later. The eunuchs had direct access to the master of the house or the ruler at almost any time. They were privy to most of the things. And when we do the two stories, we'll come there. And they also had access to some of the information that the women had. They got all access to the gossip and everything. Eunuchs had no age restriction. The passage traversed, even when people, these are very compartmentalized, but they were one where they could go both ways. He was brought to the citadel of Esma Sultanate, sister of Sultan Mahmud II. He was also in the service of the daughter of Sultan Mahmud. Why is this? Because they are part of the family, it's kinship structure. It was not an alienated labor. For many years, Aga, and I'm going to talk about Aga, he fulfilled a very intimate relationship with the eldest daughter. Now, there is a second reason why. The eunuchs did not have any families. So they could not go back anywhere. They could not reproduce. They will never have a family of their own. So they were very loyal. And there is, I think, if I remember correctly, Alauddin Khilji said at the end, everyone left me, even my wives, but the eunuch's still there. And we'll get there. The eunuchs came from foreign land. They were completely cut off. This is the only family. So this is their only network structure where they were completely loyal, not the wives of the sultan, but the eunuchs. Proposition substantiated, they are usually much concerned to the individual than the welfare of the others. So they were completely obedient. They're completely about the welfare of the household. In fact, they would give up their life even for the master. The large number of what are the reasons? The large number of seclusion of women in the courts, the character of the Muslim institution of slavery, the extensive boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, and this was also in the Arabic Peninsula. They guarded the entire courts and then came back to the family. So they had equal access to all the information network. Information was not public. This was a pre-industrial society. We didn't have a Malthusian couple and industrial revolution. The bourgeois class was not there. There's a very different system of power that's playing here. Now, this is my own research. This is not David Allen, psychoanalytic research. What is very interesting is actually Freud is deconstructed Freud's principle. Now, Freud was working under Enlightenment, and he was very fond of course, physics, the master of, the model of science, who can predictability and so forth. So if physics has an energy principle, why can't we find a similar energy principle within our bodies that will explain the human development process? And also Freud studied, he was quite conversed in the classical languages. He did study tantra. It's coming out. Tantra is all about shakti and energy and so forth. So he came up with something equal to the physics energy. He called it the pleasure principle, which he later destroyed in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle after he moved to England, his small book Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And he says it's this passage, this journey of the libido, that accounts for human development. All the pleasure first of the baby, the newborn, is concentrated on the oral region. He's very biological. When he says oral, it means oral. And then he gets a prohibition. He's weaned. He can't go on having mother's milk. So what is this pleasure? That I'll have unlimited pleasure. That's the whole thing that human beings are born on. But then there's a prohibition. He's weaned out, so he cannot have that unlimited pleasure. Then he transferred it to the anal part of the body. This is all development. And there he's passing his feces and so forth. He's getting pleasure out of it. But there also he gets a prohibition through toilet training. And these two stages, till the genital stage, people's desires, according to Freud, are polymorphous. We desire everyone. We have pleasure towards everyone. there is no identity. And for Freud, it's gender identity, basic identity is gender, and then race and class, everything else comes out. It's only during the genital stage that he enters the castration complex, which gives rise to the gender identity. I'll just go through this a little bit because I have to do the stories. We don't have a lot of time left. So the genital, at the genital stage, he enters the castration complex. What is the castration complex? That he gets something organically, according to Freud, who couldn't, I think, explain this very well, that the little boy, if you don't give up your fantasy towards the phallic mother. Who's the phallic mother? The all-giving, the powerful mother, which is depicted many of the goddesses. The phallic mother, who is both has a phallus and gives the milk, sustenance, that then will cut off your organ of pleasure, actual castration. So now he gets the message, you can't have unlimited pleasure. There is a boundary. Just as you had a boundary in the oral stage and the anal stage, you'll have a boundary here. So what he does is he puts a boundary himself to that pleasure. See, we get some, we lose some. He puts a boundary to his unlimited pleasure, and he retains his organ of pleasure, the phallus. But according to Freud, as I said, he also studied Tantra and Eastern philosophy. Nothing goes away, it transforms. As his conscious mind, his identity as a male, having the phallus, owning the phallus is born, his unconscious is also born. His search for that unlimited pleasure, the possession of the phallic mother, goes to the unconscious. So the unconscious of the male, the absolute male, is the conscious mind. I am a male, I'm the possessor of the phallus. The unconscious is that absolute search for pleasure, that ambivalent identity, which as a male cannot have. With a woman, for Freud, it's very different. She realizes she's already castrated. A little of that phallus, the clitoris, is left. And her inner thing is, and Freud gets it from the scriptures, that I must have sinned, and that's why Father, God, has punished me and cut it off. So she does everything to please Father. And she undergoes a psychical castration. She realizes mother is not the phallic mother. She doesn't have it. How can she give it to me? So she starts hating mother and all other women. This is the basis of patriarchy, actually. And then she runs to father, takes his beating, his rape, whatever, to get the phallus. He doesn't give it. She runs to mother. She doesn't give it because she doesn't have it. So she settles for what Freud calls biological destiny. She converts her original unlimited pleasure, because she doesn't have the organ of pleasure, to a pleasure for baby from father or father substitute. So the baby is the woman's phallus, but nothing, no desire goes away. So the desire for the phallus goes into the unconscious. We only desire what we lack. So the desire for the phallus is a feminine desire par excellence for Freud. Now, for Freud here, the castration complex is actually biological. It's something in the process of development to consolidate the masculine identity. So castration, if someone's castrated really as the eunuchs, then it's that, I mean, the pleasure goes away.
Professor Majumdar, you have five
Yes.
more minutes, otherwise we
Oh
won't
my
have time for
goodness.
questions.
Yeah, I have a witness to flag. These black infidels are so traitors, they fall in love. So see, they're having all these sexual pleasures. There's a very special feature of the institution of eunuchs, such as concubinage, etc. The operation done on boys aged between 8 and 10 was carried out with exceedingly high death rate. Gustav Nachingel told us that on the whole, about 30% of the survived the operation in Bagirami, while other estimates put the mortality rate at 80%. This barbaric act was made particularly cruel for black victims in contrast to their white counterpart. So I'm giving a quote. The young man was held on top of the table while his genitalia was tied off with soap-coated silk cords and then swiftly cut off with a razor. Following surgery, a wooden or then tin tube was inserted into the eunuch's urethra, and the wound was cauterized with ash and hot sand, then slightly later with boiling water. Of course, this performing the operation had to ensure that the urethra remained closed, for if it's closed, the patient would certainly die. To prevent that, the operators pushed into the opening, allowing the patient to urinate. Those in whom the penis is removed use a tube. Sorry, there's a typo to assist. Mixturation, this is probably for these reasons, convey the urine clear of the person. To prevent the contraction of the caricial orifice, which unless attended to in some patient prone to form a structure, then meant to occurrence of stone in the bladder, and which they're doubtlessly free of the senile hypertrophy of the prostate gland. One method was to causterize the wound with hot dust, sand. A second was to spread henna powder on it. Dr. Madden, however, learned the Arab pretended to stop the hemorrhage by a charm, which didn't work. And the Christian Copts were also involved in this. Henry Light wrote that a Frankenstein monk was also practicing medicine, placed butter on the newly castrated boy, which assisted a nature in the cure. Because of time limit, I'll just show one thing, and that we can also discuss while we are discussing the question answer, because I find this very interesting. Some of the parents sold their children if they knew that they would become eunuchs. Why? Because that was a position by which, the only position, the slave position, this is fantastic, by which they can rise to power. The eunuch Bashiraga, 965 968, Ikshad, Egypt, Nubian, Mish Kafur was one competent in his position. He reached a high position, and this is Bashiraga. He is well known. Now, he was born in Ethiopia, brought to the Ottoman Empire, and he actually protected the Prophet's mosque in Medina, and with numerous others. Around the age of 60, he returned to Istanbul, appointed the chief harem eunuch. He was responsible for many of the Islamic jurisprudence, Hanbali, Hanifi, Salafi, Maliki. He influenced the Hanifi school, which is the main legal jurisprudence of Islamic law. And he was, these are all things we don't need to know. But what's interesting, he's left his mark on the Istanbul and Cairo architecture, and there is a mosque by his name. And I'll end with one interesting thing is there were, about the subcontinent. There was widespread castration of slaves in Bengal during the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, which is to become a widespread practice in India. It appears that since Bakhtiyar Khilji's conquest of Bengal, which is not Bengal of the present, but Bihar also and Orissa, became a leading source of enslavement. On his way back to Venice from Kublai Khan's court, Marco Polo visited India in the late 13th century. He found Bengal as a major source of eunuchs. Duarte Barbosa in the late Sultanate period, etc., also affirms the same thing. And the moorland in Golconda, Aurangzeb, they had eunuchs. Akbar had a lot of eunuch, and with Alauddin Khilji, if I understand correctly, see Aini Akbari. Look at this. This is very interesting. Akbari confirms Emperor Akbar employed a significant number of eunuchs, often called khwajas, in different official capacity. So what my thing is, and I know my time is up, so I'll go, but we can discuss this. What is interesting is not only they enjoyed sex, something I didn't cover, that the other reason is that actually the elites male used to enjoy sex, and sometimes also women enjoyed, not so much, the elites enjoyed sex with them because they were objects, they were not acting. So Freud is wrong that with castration everything goes away, so you have to be male. See, the eunuch is the only slave where this much they would rise in power. And why that is, I still don't have that research, but probably because they had access to the entire public and private. There was no dichotomy. So that's all I have to say, but question answers, several things will come on.
Thank you very much indeed for very interesting lecture, Professor Majumdar, with strengths from various branches or various disciplines coming into your talk. We have a couple of questions from our executive director, Carl Clemens. The first is, are Freud's theories still considered valid in modern psychology?
Very good question. Feminists have destroyed Freud to a lot of extent, but one thing I have to, and I don't like Freud because his whole biological determinism doesn't work. So much of gender is sociological power and so forth. But one thing I have to say, psychiatry is still based on Freud. Maybe not psychology, but psychiatry is still based on what we nowadays talk about it, dementia, schizophrenia, and bipolar. All these are new, of course. And Foucault says every day we are increasing all these identities, which is very oppressive also in some way, like our entire medical establishment. But these have all been derived from him. So, like Marx, we don't like Marx. He has made so many problems, but there are stuff that we have learned from.
Uh,
So,
I will join here as a practicing psychiatrist. Actually, we do not give much credence to Freud anymore. Most of these diseases that you mentioned are actually neurodegenerative diseases with biological basis and some genetic components. So for Carl, yes, they may have been influential at some point in time in history of evolution of psychiatry, but at this point in time, uh, there's not much credence given to Freud. For whatever reason, different reasons, we are at a different level of scientific advancement in psychiatry that it's totally put aside. The next
actually,
question
yeah.
from Carl is there any psychological reason that two very widespread episodes of slavery are not talked about by the victim civilizations? Slavery by Islamic regimes in India and white slave trafficking in Europe.
Exactly. That's, oh my goodness. Well, I'll send that link. My panel was accepted on this in an international conference organized in Johannesburg, South Africa. And then it was rejected saying, we can't talk about it. I said, well, see, this is my explanation. I don't know if this is correct, but this is my hypothesis. All right. So what happens is in Hegel, the master and the slave. And we have taken that in post-colonial theory. The master, Europe. Europe is still the center. All our narratives are European, like Middle East. What is Middle East? From India, it's not Middle East. From Africa, it's not Middle East. Anyway, so master and slave, post-colonial. Colonizer Africa, colonizer, sorry, Europe, colonized Africa, subcontinent, Middle East, etc., etc. What this has not, and this is something a Pakistani, I'm forgetting his name, Professor Ahmed, said, that we have to rethink post-colonial theory. What this happens is we are always in the victim position. The fact that we also have a master position where we colonized, I think in India people are slowly, because the critical thinking is coming, but with Islamic thing, there is a very interesting, let me, I don't know if we have time. See, this is what Dr. Azuma says. Dr. Oh, can everyone see this? Yeah.
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, actually, he'll be in my podcast. And so I'm very excited. He says that this is ridiculous because what happened is you cannot criticize them because any criticism will be seen as an affront to Islam. What has that got to do with Islam? Must And he says something. Oh, they brought in Arab colonialism, and the Kenyan Muslims were furious, and they took it as an affront to Islam. So what and what? This is the thing where we I'm a perpetual slave victim. It's like patriarchy. Women oppress other women. Women oppress men. Women had Queen Elizabeth, if I understand correctly, he used to undress in front of slaves, saying they're half male. So it's a system of power. And we are not looking at power. And that's how I explain Deepu Das's lynching and burning alive, that it's like rape. It's a rape of the kafir identity. He's a kafir. So it's my moral duty. It's not India. They, you know what they say? Oh, Muslims are also oppressed in India. All these crimes. Yes, those are hate crimes. But the United Nations has made a very clear distinction. Let me open a little bit. Give me a little bit of, yeah. I'm just going to, yeah, share this a little bit because I want to read this out. Um, yeah, I want to read a little bit of this. Look at this. This is the basis of the United Nations definition of genocide. The destruction of a nation, not only an ethnic group. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation, which will never happen. It is extended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundation of life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. That's why Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not genocide. Even mass killing is not genocide. Genocide is a very subtle thing. And calling hate crime genocide and comparing the two, those are different.
Anyway, there are a lot of questions in the chat room. I am going to take this opportunity. We have two of our, board and executive committee members who are from Africa. And since this topic specifically pertains to Africa, if either Sanjaya or Kofiji want to say anything because of the lived experience in that culture and in that part of the geography, if you have any comments, I think this would be a good time to bring that to Professor Majumdar's attention. Either Sanjaya or Kofiji, any of you want to speak, please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Kindly unmute yourself, Kofiji. You are muted. Unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry, I got that. This is a quick one, so Sanjaya can also add something. So from what I know about slavery from Islamic world or from the Middle East, so-called, is that it started way back almost about 1,000 years before the Europeans got in. This is a story from my father to me, from my grandfather, just about 2 generations of me. My father was actually involved in slavery. He was born somewhere in the 1800s. He passed away, around about 120, 130 years, late 1980. So the story was that the Arabs got involved in slavery. That's why we moved from the Mali Empire all the way to the western part of Africa. And it was very, very brutal at that time. And so when they started to raise their voice against it and to fight against it, and then it became a war, a big war, which they couldn't actually. So the Mali Empire disintegrated and then came to an end.
Right.
So the slavery from the Middle East was actually a very, very bad experience, and hence the migration of some of the African people all the way to the West. And then came the Europeans that came in. When the Europeans came in, it wasn't about buying people. Initially, the story that they gave was that they needed people to help them in their farms and their whatever. So whenever there was conflict between 2 tribal groups and they capture people of war and that sort of thing, they would hand them over to the white people, not as slaves, initially not as slaves, but the Westerners came with a different ideology and different understanding. They had already built castles where, before they even built the castles, they had already constructed dungeons. So they had a different idea altogether. They have an agenda altogether. So that is how, that is what I know so far. But there is a lot that I know that I will bring up at some point if there's going to be another session on slavery in Africa per se, that is going to take control of both the Western side and the Islamic side and all the religion sides. I can do that. So at this point, I'll give Sanjaya the opportunity to say something if he has something to say.
Sanjaya,
thank you very much.
Please unmute yourself, Sanjaya. Sanjaya, are you there? Yeah.
Hello?
Hello. Yeah, go ahead, Sanjaya.
Okay. So I think my big brother said it all. This slavery issue came about, and you can say when you read from books and other documents, you can clearly see they came to Africa with a different ideology, as my brother was saying. At a point, dungeons were built under churches in certain parts of Ghana, that we had dungeons under churches that they thought to be preaching the word of God to the people. So in short, I'm just adding up to what my brother said. They came with a different ideology. That's what I
Right.
have to say to you.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, go ahead, Professor Majumdar.
It's very interesting. Here I have to invoke Marx a little bit. How? So there was the Mali Empire, as Sir you mentioned. There was, of course, there's slavery. There's slavery in the Mahabharata, Dasa. The word Dasa was there. Who they were, we don't know. At least I don't know. Others may know. So Marx made a distinction between a use and an exchange value. Again, I'll bring in Aristotle. What is a use value? I use this cell phone to call people, to text. What is an exchange value? I make the cell phone to sell. In other words, I can either cook. When I'm cooking to consume, or I'm cooking to sell. Now, this is the exchange value. The capitalist system is the first system where the exchange value overran the use value. So it's no longer I am producing something, oikos, to consume it, but I'm producing it to sell. Like, I'm not in the Gurukul system. My knowledge would be between me and my shishas, pupils. But now I'm selling it and I get paid at my college, and I frankly, without getting paid, I won't survive. So I'm exchanging it in the market. Now, pre-Arabic or Islamic, and I would call it Islamic because it's not just Arabic, also Turks. Arabic and Islamic colonization and Western colonization, there were slaves in Africa and in India, on the Indian subcontinent. It was not India, what is now. But it was use value. It was more private, it was domestic, it was use value. That's why they became part of the kins, but it was not exchange value. The trade wasn't there. The trading of slaves, it was a vast network. And with transatlantic slave trade, which I have very little idea, it was very closely tied to the raw material of the Industrial Revolution, the cotton mills and so forth. So that was more an external thing. But with Aristotle, like, the oikos, part of the oikos was slaves. This is also there. That's why the eunuchs were so much needed. They had all information. And the Sultan would his most favorite would be a eunuch, which is actually Malik Kafur. For people say they had a homosexual relation, which is possible. I have not done that research, between Alauddin Khilji, one for whom the Johar, Queen Padmavati, burnt herself in the Johar fire, because he was after her, and Chittor and all of that we know that history. Malik Kafur was not only the lover, but also privy to all his information. This was a much more kinship related. That's why concubinage, eunuchism, slavery, you cannot separate these.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor
So
Majumdar, for your enlightening lecture, and people enjoyed it, and there were a lot of questions. Just for the audience members, this lecture would be available on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you want to refer back to it as a educational resource, this would be available to you. Thank you, all of you. We have run out of time, so I will be ending this presentation.
thank you so much.
Okay. We are very thankful to you.